everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin, and on this channel I upload all sorts of types of content relating to true crime, education and psychology related topics. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy and you haven't already, then please do hit that subscribe button down below. So it's been a long time since I've been on this channel. I do apologise for disappearing, and a lot has changed. I don't want to ramble too much because I'm really excited to get into today's video topic, but obviously I feel like because it's been so long, I just want to quickly just say I'm back. I apologise if anything looks different, sounds different. I'm still adjusting. I'm in a new location, obviously. I'm in Essex. I've moved back down to Essex and I'm currently using natural light. I'm trying it out, so I think the lighting might change a little bit because it's quite a sunny day, but we're just going to see how it goes. I also apologise if I keep shifting my weight or anything, or if you can see this pillow underneath me. If you don't follow me on any of my other social media like my Instagram or anything, you won't know that I'm currently in my second trimester of pregnancy, so I'm at 26 weeks pregnant today. So there's a bit of adjustment going on. Bump's quite big and can get quite uncomfortable, and at the minute he's really kicking on my lungs, so I get a little bit out of breath, but hopefully everything should be all good. So enough of the rambling. For today's video, we're back with a psychology video, which I'm super excited to film. I've been really working on this research for quite a while because there is just so much that I could have put into this one video, and I wanted to condense it down enough to make sure that all the key information was there, everything that I think is useful, while it was still sort of entertaining and interesting to you guys, so it wasn't too long and rambly. So for today's video, we're going to be looking at the approaches within psychology as a topic, as a field. So these are basically like the key sort of schools of thought and approaches to everything within psychology, and this is something that people will sort of come across pretty much early on in their like psychology studies. I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, this was one of the first things that I got introduced to when I started studying at AS level. So if any of you guys are entering that phase where you want to start looking into psychology as a field because you want to study it, or if you just find psychology interesting, then hopefully this video will help you. You'll find it interesting having everything in one place. So before we get started, I'm just going to whiz through my usual disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all my videos, just letting you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the other cases that I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself through research of certain sources on the internet, and because only certain sources are accessible to me, it means I may get things wrong, I may leave things out, and I may mispronounce things. I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause anyone any harm or an injustice. I'm simply working with the information I have available to me. So with all that being said, let's just go ahead and get started discussing the approaches within psychology. So I do predict this is going to be quite a long video, and what I've done is broken it up into different segments, so you can sort of go back and look through anything maybe that you're not as confident on or that you want to recover, revisit. So to begin with, the first portion of the video, we're going to be looking at the learning approaches. So within the learning approaches, just a very quick summary, will cover things like the behaviourist approach, including classical and operant conditioning, Pavlov's research, Skinner's research, with a little bit of social learning theory. So that includes things like imitation, identification, vicarious reinforcement, as well as a little bit into Bandura's research. So beginning with the behaviourist approach. The behaviourist approach to psychology focuses on providing explanations for human behaviour that are based solely on science, meaning behaviourists would typically avoid discussing mental processes that may occur. Instead, they will focus on stimulus-response conversations, as stimuli and responses are entirely observable and quantifiable. The vast majority of research that falls under the behaviourist approach are laboratory-based experiments, due to the desire to observe and control these quantifiable variables. These laboratory experiments allowed researchers to manipulate and measure these variables, as well as typically allowing the results to be replicable, meaning they can maintain this science-focused approach. In the simplest of terms, the behaviourist approach, or behaviourism, is based on the ideas that behaviours displayed by individuals are the result of conditioning, which occurs when we're exposed to certain environmental stimuli. These stimuli and the subsequent behaviours are what are typically explored in the research that falls under this approach. The researchers proposed that behaviour is learned through experience and that humans are born as like a blank slate, meaning genetics or biological factors cannot influence behaviours. So the first big term that falls under the behaviourist approach is classical conditioning, which in short refers to learning behaviours by association. Essentially, classical conditioning is used when the learned behaviours occur as a result of two stimuli being repeatedly paired together, causing them both to eventually display at the same response. It's seen as a form of passive learning as the individual is not actively aware that they are learning and responding. The most commonly referred to piece of research in relation to classical conditioning is the experiment known as Pavlov's dogs. Pavlov classically conditioned his dogs to salivate whenever they heard the sound of a bell ringing, which had initially been a natural response they were unaware was occurring. There is a simple diagram which I'll put on the screen to sort of break down how the conditioning had occurred in this case, with some key terms that pop up throughout this particular piece of research. The unconditioned stimulus, or the UCS, in this research was the food being shown to the dogs in order to elicit a response, while the unconditioned response, or the UCR, was the dog salivating. The researcher introduced the neutral stimulus, or NS, which was the sound of the bell ringing, to the unconditioned stimulus until it would elicit the same unconditioned response. Following this being repeated numerous times, the sound of the bell ringing became the conditioned stimulus, or CS, and this no longer needed to be paired with the presentation of food to elicit the response. As a result, the dog salivating became the conditioned response, or CR. So over time, the dogs would naturally begin to salivate at the sound of the bell ringing, even when there wasn't any food being presented alongside it, as they had learned to associate the sound with food. Watson and Rayner's Little Albert experiment is also another piece of research that is often used as an example to support the reasoning behind the behaviourist approach, which I'll sort of just briefly go over. So this experiment consisted of a 11-month-old boy who was referred to as Little Albert, who was shown a number of neutral stimuli, including a white rat, a fluffy rabbit, a monkey, and a number of masks. He had initially shown no fear towards any of these stimuli, but he was visibly startled when a hammer was suddenly struck against a steel bar that was placed behind him by a researcher. They continued to attempt to condition the young boy by presenting him with a white rat, again followed by them then striking the hammer against the steel bar just seconds later, which would obviously startle him. This was continued multiple times across a 2-week period, which ultimately led to Albert now reacting to the white rat with tears and avoidance when it was presented alongside the loud noise. The experiment was continued, which led the researchers to discover that the young boy had developed a phobia of not only the white rat, but also other objects which shared similar sort of visible characteristics with the rat, including a fur coat and some cotton wool. This extension was a demonstration of something called generalization, meaning that the conditioned responses or associations can develop further than the initial specific stimuli presented. The Little Albert experiment also demonstrates another concept known as extinction, meaning that a conditioned response or association can actually fade over time if it's not continually reinforced, likely leading to it disappearing entirely. Watson and Rayner found that if they did not continue to reinforce this phobia, it would become less prominent over time. The next big term that falls under the behaviourist approach is operant conditioning, which in short refers to learning by reinforcement. Positive reinforcement will encourage a certain behaviour to be repeated, but if the behaviour is met with a form of punishment, this will decrease the likelihood of the behaviour then being repeated. Whilst classical conditioning was a form of passive learning, operant conditioning is a form of active learning, as the behaviours are shaped by the consequences. In terms of research, Skinner's rat experiment is typically used to offer an example of how operant conditioning can occur. In Skinner's study, a rat was placed into a box which featured a lever, and if the rat had pressed on this lever, then a food pellet would be delivered to the rat. And this food pellet acted as a reward for the rat for displaying this type of behaviour, and as the rat continued to display this behaviour and then be given food in response, it suggested that the rat's actions were being positively reinforced. Following this, Skinner altered the mechanism within the box so that when the rat pressed the lever, it would actually no longer receive this food pellet, but it would instead be given a mild electric shock. In response, the rat very quickly stopped pressing the lever due to the electric shock being administered as a form of punishment for the rat's learned behaviour. And Skinner then introduced the concept of negative reinforcement into the experiment. So in this variation, he had altered the box so that a small light would turn on when the floor of the box that the rat was in was entirely electrified. When the floor was electrified, the rat would then begin to obviously bounce around in the box in response, subsequently causing it to accidentally press on the lever. As a result of pressing the lever, the light would be turned off and the electric current would stop. This light would then come on again, and so would the current, so that the rat had learned to press the lever in order to stop the current, making it an example of negative reinforcement. So essentially, negative reinforcement is the encouragement of learned behaviour by removing this negative impact. Moving on to social learning theories. The concept of social learning theory will typically fall under the scope of the learning approaches. However, it does offer some slightly different standpoints to typical behaviourist theories. So social learning theory was initially proposed by a man named Albert Bandura, and the approach instead investigates how not only environmental factors but also cognitive factors have an influence on human behaviours. So Bandura acted in support of some of the behaviourist learning theories, namely the classical and operant conditioning, but also introduced two additional focuses. Firstly, he wanted to build on the conditioning concepts by mediating the processes that occur between the examined stimuli and the subsequent responses. He then also proposed that behaviour can also be learned through the environment through something called observational learning. And this is where it links in with Bandura's Bobo doll experiment. Bandura's Bobo doll experiments carried out in the 1960s remain some of the most commonly referred to pieces of research, providing an example of this concept of observational learning. The basis of the Bobo doll experiments was the intention of conducting a controlled experiment to examine whether social behaviours can be learned through observation and imitation. In short, the first study saw 36 boys and 36 girls, all aged between 3 and 6 years old, from the same nursery school, being placed in a room in a nursery, and they had their levels of initial aggression observed and measured on 4 5-point rating scales. The experiment demonstrated a matched pairs design, as the children were grouped based on their initial level of aggression that they were seen to display in their everyday behaviours. The independent variable was manipulated by using 3 different conditions. 24 of the children were shown the aggressive model, 24 were shown the non-aggressive model, and the remaining 24 acted as a control condition, which means that they were shown no model. In the first stage of the experiment, the children were individually introduced to a room where there were numerous toys available for them to play with. The children were left in this environment for around 10 minutes under one of the 3 conditions. So the 24 children who were in the aggressive model were exposed to watching a male or a female role model displaying aggressive behaviours towards a toy called a Bobo doll on a screen. The aggressive behaviour they were watching these role models carry out on this Bobo doll were particularly distinctive and violent, with some of them going as far as to attack the doll with a hammer. Some were shouting distinctive sounds like pow and boom. The second group of 24 children who were shown the non-aggressive model was shown images of these role models playing with the Bobo doll, or not even playing with the Bobo doll, but in an entirely calm manner. And then the remaining 24 children were shown no interaction with the Bobo doll. Following this stage, each of the children were individually taken to a room where there were numerous toys once again to play with. The experimenter went ahead as to explain to each of the children that the toys were their very best toys, and that because of this, she had decided to save them for other children to use. This particular interaction was used as a form of mild aggression arousal. And in stage 3 of the experiment, the children were exposed to a number of toys in a room deemed as both aggressive and non-aggressive. So there was a mixture of different types of toys. So those that were deemed as non-aggressive were things like crayons, soft bears, plastic animals, and a tea set, while the aggressive toys included a small mallet and pegboard, a dart gun, and a 3-foot-tall Bobo doll. The children were each left alone in this room for 20 minutes, and their behaviours were observed through this one-way mirror, with the experimenter making observations of the child's behaviour in 5-second intervals. The researchers found that the children who had observed the aggressive role model had displayed behaviours that were deemed as far more aggressive than those in the non-aggressive and the control groups. They'd also found that the girls in the aggressive model conditions displayed more physical aggressive responses when the role model that they observed was male, but displayed more verbally aggressive responses when the role model they observed was female. But in total, the male children typically displayed more physically aggressive acts than the females. There were a number of other findings that came about as a result of the experiment, but just sort of in order to give you a brief understanding, I thought I'd just focus on those points, and I definitely recommend you doing your own research and really digging into the research of Bandura if you want to know a little bit more and go a little bit more in depth. All in all, the Bobo doll experiment had demonstrated that the children were able to learn behaviours such as aggression through observing the behaviour of someone else, referred to as observational learning. And back to social learning theory in a broader sense, this theory differs from the behaviourist approach by suggesting that something called mediational processes are necessary in order for learning to occur. So this term mediational processes referred to cognitive processes that are involved in learning, and Bandura identified a total of 4 mediational processes that fit into social learning theory. So the first is attention. So the person needs to pay attention to the behaviour and consequences, ultimately forming a mental representation of the behaviour before it can be imitated. Number 2 is retention, how well the behaviour is remembered. Number 3 is motor reproduction, so the ability of the observer to perform the behaviour. And number 4 is motivation, the will to perform their behaviour, which is often determined by whether the original observed behaviour was rewarded or punished. The concept of vicarious reinforcement is introduced in social learning theory, and it suggests that whether or not we imitate an observed behaviour partially depends on the observed consequences of said behaviour. The reinforcement doesn't have to be directly experienced by the individual, but they may observe the reinforcement of someone else's behaviours, causing the act of imitation to be more or less likely. It is worth noting that in 1986, Bandura renamed the theory to social cognitive theory as a more sort of encompassing description of what it proposes, and sometimes you may come across this in your research. There are obviously points that act in support and opposing of each of the approaches, so I thought I would run through a few of the basic arguments for each one. So in terms of the evaluation for the behaviourist approach, it's often supported by a significant amount of experimental research and data due to the nature of the theories. As a whole, the behaviourist approach had created a gateway for scientific methods to be introduced into the field of psychology, where laboratory experiments are encouraged as the variables can be controlled and measured. As a result of this, psychological studies became replicable and the findings could be classed as valid and not influenced by opinion, ultimately encouraging psychology as a field to make sort of strides towards it being seen as more credible. Due to the nature of the experiments being favoured in this approach, i.e. laboratory experiments, there were a significant amount of research experiments that were carried out using animals. I'm sure you can gather there are a number of arguments against this concept, not only in the name of morals and ethics, but also simply that there is no way to conclusively state that animals and humans will respond and function in the same way. There are a number of hugely beneficial applications of the concepts developed in the behaviourist approach, including the development of systematic desensitization to treat phobias as a result of the understanding of classical conditioning. The behaviourist approach as a whole has been criticised for refusing to take into account the impact of biological factors on behaviours. A prime example of this would be the link between low levels of serotonin and the prevalence of depression. Theory also fails to provide explanations for key aspects of human behaviours like memory, as the mental processes involved in such cannot be observed. It also generally suggests that individuals are entirely passive in the learning of their behaviours and diminishes the concept of free will in our behaviour. Social learning theory is arguably supported by laboratory research, such as those carried out by Bandura in the 1960s. However, as these were laboratory experiments, it can be said that the behaviours displayed within this research may differ from how participants would act in actual day-to-day life outside of this controlled environment. There is also a lot of argument both for and against the validity and reliability of using children as participants in laboratory experiments, but that a whole different can of worms to open. It is worth noting that the research carried out by Bandura that ultimately acts in support of the social learning theory does not explain why there is evidence of gender differences between learned behaviours, such as the aggression that was shown in the Bobo doll study. These gender differences suggest that there may be other contributing factors, such as biological ones, like testosterone, causing the boys to typically show more aggressive behaviours. Social learning theory does, however, have some support in its explanation for cultural differences. The theory essentially would suggest that if a certain behaviour is not displayed, it cannot be imitated and learned, which would suggest why some cultural groups, such as the Amish, do not engage in acts of violence. It also provides some form of understanding into the influence of things like media on aggressive behaviour. There are numerous studies and individual cases where social media, news footage, video games, and everything that falls under that sort of umbrella are used as an explanation for individuals' acts of violence, just as an example. And social learning theory is considered a slightly more inclusive approach, as it does consider the potential cognitive factors that go into learning. But just as with behaviourism, it fails to consider the concept of free will and an individual's morals and values. So next, I'm going to move on and discuss the cognitive approach to psychology. So the cognitive approach to psychology focuses its explanations of human behaviour on how it's impacted by mental processes, and that these should be studied scientifically. There are often many comparisons made in this comparing a human brain's processes to a computer's internal working systems. The focus of this theory is on how our brains register information, how it's stored, and then how we subsequently retrieve it. So commonly referred to models which fall under the umbrella of this approach are the multi-store models of memory. In basic terms, the assumption of this approach is that we collect information from our senses, which is then processed by our brain, and then these processes dictate our behavioural responses. The theory suggests that these processes cannot necessarily be observed, but we are able to observe an individual's behaviours and infer what they are thinking based on this physical output. The term schemas is key when understanding the cognitive approach to psychology. So a schema is a mental framework of expectations that are developed from previous experience, and because of this they will become sort of more detailed as you age. These schemas seemingly help us to organise and interpret information that we gather from our senses. This process can be quick and effective as it allows us to process and understand information that we perceive from external factors without being overwhelmed. But it does mean that there are some potential for distortion to occur, as it's entirely possible for us to interpret stimuli from our environment using schemas that are not necessarily relevant. If this occurs, it may lead to inaccuracies in our understanding of such stimuli, and a really prevalent example of this is the inaccuracies in the testimonies that are provided by eyewitnesses in some particular court cases. Cognitive neuroscience as a field is often linked to the cognitive approach of psychology, as neuroscience seeks to understand brain structures and how they influence the processing of information, as well as mapping out where specific cognitive functions occur within the brain through using techniques like MRI and PET scans. Due to its nature, studies falling under the scope of the cognitive approach will typically take the form of laboratory experiments, as the extraneous variables can be closely controlled and the experiments as a whole can be replicated. However, as mentioned previously, this form of experiment can lack ecological validity, as the results are obtained in a controlled laboratory sort of experimental environment as opposed to a real life situation. When looking into the cognitive approach, you may also come across case studies that examine individuals who display rare conditions as a result of specific mental processes. An example of this would be the case of Clive Waring. So in short, Clive Waring was an individual who received brain damage directly to the hippocampus area of the brain following a viral infection. His case was studied and observed by a man named Colin Blakemore in 1988, and he reported some prominent findings regarding his memory. It was determined that Clive Waring maintained the use of his short-term memory, as he was able to remember new pieces of external information for approximately 20 seconds after exposure, but then the information would be forgotten. He essentially was unable to store new memories, as the external information collected by his senses could not be transferred from his short-term memory to his long-term memory to be stored. This case obviously would operate in support of the multi-store model of memory, and memory is a whole different topic in itself. So if you would like me to make a video on that, then let me know in the comments. As a whole, the cognitive approach is often supported due to its inclusion of scientific research methods, making the supporting evidence highly credible. However, the approach is often criticised for its emphasis on human personality and internal processes being comparable to that of a computer system, as this approach would arguably ignore the involvement of emotion within human behaviour. The term reductionist is often used to criticise this approach because of this, as it reduces down just how complex humans and human behaviour is, and it's also particularly difficult to test and measure a lot of the concepts within this approach, as they focus on the internal mental processes that may occur. So the next approach I'm going to focus on is the biological approach to psychology, which is arguably the largest section purely because there's a lot of terminology involved. So the biological approach to psychology focuses on the role of the nervous system, hormones and genetics on behaviour. Research that falls under this approach aims to understand the relationship between the mind and the physical body, how our neural mechanisms have possibly an impact, and whether or not certain behaviours that we display are hereditary. In short, the approach operates on the belief that our behaviour is all the result of our genetics and physiology, therefore examines our thoughts, feelings and subsequent behaviours from a biological perspective. The approach proposes that everything we think, feel and do has a biological root cause, and biological psychology studies this concept in three distinct ways. So firstly, through the comparative method. So this sees different animal species behaviours being studied and compared in an attempt to further understand human behaviour. The second is through the understanding of human physiology. So this can be everything from how changes in the structure of our brain changes behaviour, how certain elements within the brain actually function, and how our hormones have an impact on our biological selves. And third, through an investigation of inheritance, i.e. the study of genetics. Twin studies are a key element within this approach, as they allow us to gain an understanding into the impact of inherited factors and how they may differ from person to person. So to begin with, it's worth noting that there are two different types of twins. So monozygotic, which are identical twins, meaning they share 100% of their genetic information, and dizygotic, which are non-identical twins, meaning that they share 50% of their genetic information, much like siblings. Studies using twins as participants aim to study the degree of concordance, which is the level of similarity of certain traits between identical and non-identical twins. The twins are considered concordant for a specific trait if either both or neither of them display it, and discordant for a trait if one displays it while the other does not. The approach argues that since identical twins share 100% of their genetic information, the concordance rates are significantly higher for traits than those found in non-identical twins, meaning that this in itself is evidence that genetics play a key role in behaviour. In the 1980s, two researchers named Bouchard and McGeough looked at the results of 111 studies from across the world comparing IQ results and family members, and compared this set of results in a review format. They put together a collection of figures displaying the similarity between a certain group of people within the family and their similarity of IQ scores. They found that the IQ results of identical twins raised together had the highest degree of similarity, followed by identical twins raised apart. Non-identical twins raised together followed behind this, followed by siblings raised together, siblings raised apart, and finally cousins. In short, these findings would suggest that the trait of IQ is closely linked with genetics, considering the family members who shared the most genetic information were found to display the most similar IQ results. There are, however, a number of criticisms that are to be considered in relation to this particular study or meta-analysis, as well as other twin studies. But with this meta-analysis in particular, it's been argued that a number of the studies that they actually included in their results, so in their report that they looked at, had a number of flaws themselves. So the original studies had a number of issues, including like biases and things like that. So they were basing this report off of sort of flawed experiments. But it is just one good example of how twin studies are used within this approach. So back to the biological approach as a whole, As I said, its main focus is to understand our human physiology and how it impacts our behaviours. The first main area to sort of understand is the divisions of the nervous system. So the nervous system is the human body's main communication system, where responses to environmental stimuli are shared and the processes carried out by the organs and the cells within the body are coordinated. Within the nervous system, there are two subsystems. So there's the central nervous system, or the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, which is the PNS. The central nervous system is made up of the brain, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. It's responsible for receiving the information from our senses and regulates the physiological processes that occur as a response to these stimuli. Focusing specifically on the brain, our brains obviously receive the information from our sensory receptors and then transmits messages to our muscles and glands, but there are different lobes and areas within the brain that are all responsible for specific functions. Obviously, I can't go into complete depth about the structure of the brain, but I just wanted to sort of have a bit of an overview so you can understand how the brain is separated and how certain processes occur in certain areas. So the area known as the forebrain is separated into two parts. The first is the diencephalon, which contains the thalamus, which relays sensory information from the brainstem to the cortex, as well as the hypothalamus, which controls the basic functions like hunger and thirst, and also it controls the pituitary gland. The cerebral hemispheres are responsible for controlling higher level cognitive and emotional processes. So this includes the limbic system, which is linked with memory and emotion, the basal ganglia responsible for movement and motor responses, and the cerebral cortex, which is involved in things like problem solving, language, personality, and other functions. The peripheral nervous system is part of the nervous system that falls outside of the brain and the spinal cord, and its primary responsibility is to transmit information to and from the central nervous system through the neurons and nerve cells. And the peripheral nervous system can then also be divided into two subsystems. These are the ANS, which is the autonomic nervous system, and the SNS, which is the somatic nervous system. The ANS is responsible for regulating things like body temperature, heart rate, and blood pressure, and it's composed of two parts. So firstly, the sympathetic nervous system, which provides the body's responses to emergency situations such as blood pressure and heart rate, and then the parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for relaxing the body once the emergency is over, that triggered things like the raise in heart rate. The SNS, or the somatic nervous system, is responsible for controlling voluntary movements as well as providing reflex reactions in response to messages received from the senses. The SNS links the CNS with the senses through sensory nerve pathways that provide the sensory information to the CNS using sensory receptors, and motor nerve pathways that control bodily movements by sending instructions directly to our muscles. It's also important to understand the function of different neurons that make up the nervous system. So sensory neurons send information regarding the sensory stimuli to the brain, so this can be something you see, taste, etc. Motor neurons will send information for physical operations like muscle movement or releasing hormones. Relay neurons will connect the different areas of the CNS, and I'll try and find a good diagram to sort of help display this a little bit better while I'm talking through it. But within the nervous system, these neurons aren't connected, but once an electrical signal meets the axon terminals, molecules of neurotransmitters are released across the synaptic gap, which is the space that separates each of the neurons. These then attach to the postsynaptic receptors on the adjacent neuron, subsequently triggering an electrical impulse in the adjacent cell. And during the process of this synaptic transmission, an electrical impulse, which is the action potential, then causes the synaptic vesicles of the presynaptic neuron to release a chemical message, which is known as a neurotransmitter. These neurotransmitters then move out across the synaptic gap between the pre- and postsynaptic neurons and bind to the specialized receptor sites of the postsynaptic neuron. And the action of the neurotransmitters found at the synapses can either be one, excitatory, which makes a nerve impulse more likely to be triggered, or two, inhibitory, which makes a nerve impulse less likely to be triggered. So I know there's a lot of information that I've just thrown at you there, but again, I just wanted to provide a very quick, brief introduction to this, and there's a lot of diagrams and things online that help this sort of information stick. I know personally I'm a very visual learner, so seeing a diagram while trying to understand information like that really does help me. The next key thing to understand within the field of biological psychology is the function of the endocrine system. So this includes glands and hormones. The hormones are the chemical messengers that are released from our glands in our bodies that then pass through our bloodstreams to create some kind of change in our body. And the endocrine system is the name given to the network of glands that we all have. The different endocrine glands that we all have in the network are responsible for the release of certain hormones. So there's so many to list, but for example, the thyroid gland releases the thyroxine hormone, which is responsible for regulating metabolic rate and protein synthesis, whereas the adrenal cortex releases corticosteroids, which are responsible for the release of glucose and fats for energy, as well as the suppression of the immune system. The pituitary gland is the controlling gland that directs the release of hormones from the vast majority of the main glands within the network. And this master gland is divided into two segments, so the anterior and the posterior. The hormones released in the anterior pituitary include things like ACTH, prolactin, and growth hormones, while in the posterior it releases things like vasopressin and oxytocin. There's a whole list of things that each are responsible for. Adrenaline and our fight or flight response is also something that is considered important in this approach in understanding and explaining human behaviours. So I'm sure you all know that the fight or flight response is the reaction triggered by your body when it's preparing to either attack or defend or run to safety. So it's a form of stress response which is hardwired into our brains to allow survival in life-threatening situations. And there are two main systems that are involved in our fight or flight response. The first is the sympathomedullary pathway, which deals with the short-term or the immediate stressors like direct personal attacks. And then the pituitary adrenal system, which deals with the long-term and ongoing stressors like a difficult job. Within the scope of the sympathomedullary pathway falls the hypothalamus, which activates the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is part of the autonomic nervous system, which is responsible for performing activities within our body that occur naturally without us being aware. The adrenal medulla itself releases adrenaline, which is the hormone that prepares our body for the fight or flight response. Physiological reactions that occur as a result of this are things like an increased heart rate. In short, the release of this adrenaline triggers the arousal of the sympathetic nervous system and reduces the activity in the parasympathetic nervous system. The adrenaline will create decrease in certain activities like digestion and then increase things like sweating and blood pressure until the environmental threat is over. Once it's over, the parasympathetic nervous system kicks back in and begins to balance out the activities within the body. The next thing to consider within the umbrella of biological psychology is localization of the function of the brain. The term localization is used to refer to the knowledge that specific areas of the brain are associated with specific functions and behaviours. This knowledge was discovered in the 19th century when, prior to this, the belief was that the brain had to work as a whole to carry out tasks. So in short, the brain is split into four main areas. There's the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And each of these areas are connected with different functions. So the motor area is at the back of the frontal lobe and it's responsible for controlling voluntary movements in the opposite sides of the body. The somatosensory area is located in the front of the parietal lobe, where sensory information from skin is processed, so things like heat. The visual cortex is located in the occipital lobe and it's responsible for processing visual information. The left visual cortex receives information from the right eye and then vice versa. The auditory area is found within the temporal lobes and that's responsible for analysing any sort of spoken information. So if you damage any of these areas within your brain, the specific functioning that they are responsible for may be affected. So for example, damage to the visual cortex may lead to possible sight loss. Each of these areas are found in both hemispheres of the brain, but something referred to as the language area only appears to be present in the left hemisphere for the majority of people. A surgeon named Paul Broca had identified an area within the left frontal lobe, which is now referred to as Broca's area. The area was found to be responsible for the production of speech, and any damage to this specific area may impact an individual's ability to fluently speak, and this is a condition which is now referred to as Broca's aphasia. Another region within the brain identified by Carl Wernicke is now referred to as Wernicke's area. It's found within the left temporal lobe, and it's found to be responsible for language comprehension. And so if this isolated area is damaged, the individual may find that they are only able to verbalise nonsense words, and this is called Wernicke's aphasia. The case of Phineas Gage in 1948 acts in support of the concept of localization of function. So Gage suffered an unfortunate accident which resulted in a metal pole being driven through his skull, mostly impacting his left frontal lobe. He did survive the accident, but was reported as having an entirely new personality afterwards. He was described as suddenly becoming very short-tempered, and this would propose that the area of the brain that was affected, so in this case it was the frontal lobe, it may be responsible for mood regulation. A study conducted by Peterson et al. In 1988 found evidence to suggest that Wernicke's area was visibly active when the individual was asked to perform listening tasks, and then Broca's area was active when they were asked to conduct reading tasks, ultimately supporting this belief that there are different areas of the brain that are responsible for different functions. The biological approach to psychology is supported due to its scientific nature, and methods such as EEGs, fMRIs, and PET scans can be used to examine the concepts alongside things like twin studies. So a key argument against the use of twin studies to determine the genetic link of behaviour is that it's very unlikely that researchers have found a 100% concordance rate in identical twins for mental disorders, which ultimately suggests that there must be some external factors involved in these being developed. Within the biological approach, there have been some key real-life applications that were developed. For example, our understanding of how neurotransmitters work have led to the development of a number of drugs that are used to help treat mental disorders, so things like antidepressants. The question of cause and effect does come into play though with this concept. For example, it's known that individuals with depression are found to have low levels of serotonin. So does the low levels of the neurotransmitter lead to the development of depressive symptoms, or does depressed thinking cause the low levels of serotonin? The biological approach is also often criticised as being determinist, meaning that it suggests that our behaviour is a result of biological factors that we have absolutely no control over. Essentially, it has the ability to encourage individuals to not take responsibility for their behaviours, but rather blame them on factors like their genetics. And it's also seen as a reductionist approach by some, as it reduces human behaviour down to being the result of just biological factors, failing to take into account other potential factors that may impact us, such as our environment during our upbringing. So the next approach we're going to move on to is the psychodynamic approach to psychology. In terms of the psychodynamic approach, the main assumption is that all behaviour is the result of inner conflicts of the mind. One of the main theories proposed within this approach is Freud's concept of tripartite personality. So Freud proposed that the human personality is made up of three parts: the id, the superego, and the ego. The id is the biological area of the personality, so it deals with instincts and it's present from birth, according to Freud. The id operates on instant gratification of needs, so it's driven by pleasure and innate needs. In terms of the ego, Freud proposed this area of the unconscious mind develops in everyone somewhere between the ages of 1 and 3. This is the area that is motivated by reality, and it mediates any conflict between the id and the superego using defense mechanisms. And then with the superego, Freud claimed this area develops from 3 to 5 years of age, and this area is motivated by morality and what is considered right and wrong. So the concept suggests that in order to be mentally healthy, the ego has to be able to balance out both the superego and the id. A dominant superego may result in evident behaviours of neuroses, such as depression, while a dominant id may lead to behaviours that fall under the psychosis brackets, such as schizophrenia. The psychodynamic approach also links with Freud's concept of the unconscious mind, stating that the mind is divided into three parts. So there is the conscious, which is the area of the mind that we are aware of and have full ability to access, and it's where part of the ego is located. Then there's the preconscious, so this is the area of the mind that we cannot access without putting in effort, and this contains part of the ego and part of the superego. And then there's the unconscious, which cannot be accessed unless it's through enlisting the help of a professional psychoanalyst, and this contains part of the superego and the id. The theory proposes that when conflicts arise between the id and the superego, the ego would typically attempt to resolve them. However, if this cannot be done, it's proposed that anxiety can be formed as a result, and in an attempt to reduce this feeling of anxiety, the mind implements defense mechanisms. So I do want to make an entire video on defense mechanisms, so I won't go into too much detail. I'm just going to cover sort of the main three that are often referred to in relation to the psychodynamic approach, just sort of to give an introduction. The first is repression. So the ego uses this in order to keep specific memories out of the conscious mind and holds them in the unconscious mind where they can't be actively accessed by the individual. The second is displacement. So an act of impulse may be redirected from one target to one that's deemed as more acceptable. So for example, being angry at one person but shouting at someone else. And the third is denial. So the existence of something unpleasant is denied and it's kept away from the conscious mind. So for example, losing your job but then continuing to turn up to work every day. Another key concept within the approach is what's known as the psychosexual stages of development, which was also a concept that was introduced by Freud. In short, he proposed that within different stages that occur at different points in your life or your development, you have some form of some source of pleasure. And if some form of conscious or unconscious trauma occurs within one of these stages, there are specific likely outcomes. So again, I'll put up some form of table or diagram just so it's a little bit easier to follow while I'm talking through. But the first stage is the oral stage, which develops between the ages of 0 and 1 years old. So he proposed that the sources of pleasure in this stage are things like sucking and swallowing, and the outcome of some form of trauma during this stage may be a fixation or dependency on oral activities that can present themselves later in life, so things like smoking, and if situations such as forceful feeding or deprivation or early weaning occur in this stage of development, that can be some form of trauma. This is followed by the anal stage between 1 to 3 years old, and the source of pleasure is the anus, so withholding or expelling feces is typically what's displayed, and the outcome of this may result as toilet training that is too harsh or too lax, as it could lead to a fixation on tiredness or meanness or extreme behaviours that are the complete opposite. Then there's the phallic stage, which is usually developed between 3 and 5 years of age. The source of pleasure of this is the penis or the clitoris, so this is the concept of masturbation. And in terms of outcome, if there is an unusual family setup leading to an abnormal relationship with a parent, it may lead to sexual anxiety, inadequacy, inferiority, or the complete opposite in vanity and self-obsession. The fourth stage is the latent stage. So this typically occurs between 5 years old and puberty. In terms of source of pleasure with this, the sexual drives are typically repressed and no fixation really occurs if there's trauma at this age. And finally, there is the genital stage. So this is believed to have occurred between puberty and death. So the genitals are the source of pleasure, and fixation at this stage should occur in a mentally healthy adult. The emergence of the psychodynamic approach aided the creation of psychoanalysis, which is a method that was used to base a lot of modern day psychological therapies on. But a lot of the concepts proposed by this approach are extremely difficult to test due to the sheer fact that they are by nature within the mind. There are a select few case studies that are often referred to as a form of experimental evidence, but due to the nature of the method and the participants use, they are typically lacking in population validity. It's also very difficult to falsify the approach, as for example, people may behave in a way that the theory proposes, or if they don't, it may be argued that they are only behaving as such due to a defense mechanism. It also fails to consider biological symptoms that are displayed within certain conditions that can be shown through things like imaging techniques, as discussed in the biological approach. As an approach, it also appears to reject the concept of free will, as an individual's behaviour is determined by their unconscious mind, which in turn was shaped by their early experiences. The approach does, however, take into account both elements of the nature versus nurture debate, as it proposes that we are driven by biological instincts, but the way that they manifest themselves is determined by factors within our environment in early life. And the final approach I'm going to cover is the humanistic approach to psychology. So the humanistic approach to psychology proposes that everyone has their own unique way of perceiving the external world, and their behaviours in response are made depending on what makes sense to this perception. So because of this, the approach focuses on aiming to understand people's subjectivity, which differs entirely from other approaches. The approach suggests that all individuals have free will to make choices about how they think or act, and each of these choices aren't determined by factors like biology. The concept of self-actualization is key within this approach. It suggests that all people have the natural tendency to want to fulfill their potential. A theory proposed by Maslow suggests that people must have all of their needs met for self-actualization to be possible, and this is when he created the concept of the hierarchy of needs. So the basic needs at the bottom of the hierarchy must be met first in order to then move higher on up the hierarchy to eventually reach self-actualization. The approach also suggests that self-actualization is only fully possible if there is complete congruence between the way the person views themselves and their ideal self, so what they want to be or how they think that they should be. If there is a vast difference between these two selves, it leaves room for negative opinions towards themselves and ultimately making it impossible for this self-actualization to occur. This approach to psychology had applications in client-centered therapy, which aims to increase the self-worth of the clients, to increase their congruence between their actual self and their ideal self. These therapies encourage the individual to find their own solutions in a supportive environment, and it focuses on the present rather than delving into the past of the individual. There are a lot of elements within humanistic psychology that are commonly used and referred to this day. So factors like Maslow's hierarchy of needs are often taught and applied within a lot of workplaces as a framework for understanding the needs of themselves and clients. And client-centered therapy itself is something that is widely used in a lot of industries to this day, which appears to be significantly improving a lot of people's quality of life. Research carried out within this approach typically use non-scientific methods as they are looking to understand individuals' subjectivity, like I said. The focus is on qualitative data within this research, so like unstructured interviews, but these methods themselves obviously have criticisms such as difficulty in replicating them and the possibility of the results being influenced by researcher bias, so they could interpret the results slightly differently, varying from person to person. And the approach does also recognise both nature and nurture as an influence on behaviour, as there is a combination of the person's way of perceiving the world suggesting an argument of nurture, whilst the influence of biological needs, as suggested in Maslow's hierarchy, suggests an impact of nature. But that is where I'm going to end today's video. Like I said, there is so much information that goes into each of these approaches, and pretty much every topic that you encounter within the field of psychology falls under one of these sort of schools of thought, so one of these approaches. So if I delve too far into any particular approach, I start then seeping into certain other topics like memory or defense mechanism. So I try to keep it as simplified as possible to give you all an introduction, and then obviously if there's anything in particular you want to find a little bit more information on, you can either leave it in a comment down below and I can maybe make a separate video on it, or at least I hope this is what I've done, but I hope I've sort of given you a little bit of an intro and sort of a direction in which you can focus your own research on. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and please do leave any other topics you'd like me to cover down below. These are obviously my favourite types of videos to film, all these psychology topics, so if there is anything that you want me to cover, then please do let me know. I hope you're all doing well. Thank you for being patient with me, and I will see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.